Okay, so while we're waiting, I'll just, I might talk about Modern Money Australia and what we do. We're a volunteer organisation that we sort of began about a year ago, just over a year ago, and the co-founders are myself, Dallas Lewis and Josh Dalton. Josh has been very busy this year arranging most of the events that we've had online, the webinars, and including this event with Fadhel. So thanks, Josh. We are now an incorporated association, so we have people from all over Australia involved in helping run these webinars and to do things behind the scenes. We're making contact with various organisations across different sectors, so the health sector and unions and political parties, and trying to organise events with different speakers and spread the word about modern monetary theory. I recently had an event with the Public Health Association, which you can probably see live on their Vimeo channel, will be published this week. That was with Noel Pearson, Bill Mitchell, and and John Quiggin. That was a fascinating discussion. We also had recently a webinar with John Harvey. We've had several webinars with Martin Watts, and you can see all of those. We've got probably over a dozen videos available on our channel, which you can watch. We've got one coming up for the final one for the year, which is with Daniel DeVos, and that's in a couple of weeks' time. You should be able to register for that now if you either go to our website or you can go to our social media and find the event, and we'll also promote it over the coming days. So Modern Money Australia is basically, as I said, the purpose of our association is to promote a better understanding of macroeconomics as described by modern monetary theory. And this is in order to foster a shift in the political discourse and aiming to create an economy that works for the well-being of all. So at the moment, we are far from achieving that, and we aspire to change that. I want to thank Fadhel for coming. I've been a big fan and often go to his any podcasts or lectures that he has on YouTube to feel recharged and get me on the right path again and give me a bit of hope. And thank everyone for attending as well, and our regular attendees and people who have donated to help cover our costs. As we're a group of volunteers, we sort of give our time to run this organisation, and there are a few costs associated with just running the webinars. So you'll find when you register, you have the option through Eventbrite to donate if you can, and every dollar counts. So if you are able to, only if you're able to, we appreciate that. So as it's now 11:05, we might get started on the presentation. So Fadhel is going to be speaking first on the MMT framework for colonial and climate reparations, a global Green New Deal. So he will present, and then following that, we'll have a Q&A session with attendees, and you can write, if you can write actually all your questions in the Q&A box, and that way you can be guaranteed we will get to them if we can. If you'd like to ask your question live, you can raise your virtual hand and we'll come to you live and allow you to ask your question live to Fadhel. So saying that, I think we'll get started on the presentation. Thank you, Fadhel. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak to your audience. I'm sharing my screen right now, so if you could confirm that you can see my slide. I'm going to switch to presentation view. Should take a second to load.
Yeah, we can see. I can see.
This is working okay?
Yeah, it's
right.
working. Yeah.
Zoom has all these little windows that block my view, but I'm hoping they don't block yours. I think they don't. Okay, so what I wanted to do today is kind of sketch a framework for an MMT-informed framework for what I call a global Green New Deal. And to me, as you'll see from the details in this presentation, a global Green New Deal from an MMT framework cannot really take off unless it includes a framework for climate reparations, for colonial reparations, and few other details that I'll lay out today. So let's start with the basics, I suppose, because some people in the audience might be hearing about MMT for the first time. So I thought I'll just do a little mini MMT refresher without all the detailed nuances. And I would urge newcomers to the MMT framework, obviously in Australia, to follow the work of Bill Mitchell, Stephen Hale, and Phil Lawn and others, and then in the US and beyond, Stephanie Kelton, obviously, and Randy Ray and Warren Mosler and the rest of the MMT crowd. So with that, let me see if this works. Okay, so I'd like to start with this thing about a fiscal policy space, and mainstreamers use this phrase in a different context. So from a mainstream perspective, when I say mainstream, it's mainstream politicians, it's mainstream economists, the general public. There's this belief that the spending capacity of the national government or the federal government is limited by tax revenues. So this is the household analogy. And to some extent is limited by the borrowing capacity of that government. Beyond that, they say, that's it, we can't go beyond that, which means if we're asking for better healthcare system, if we're asking for fighting climate change, they say, sorry, this is the spending capacity of the federal government, of the national government. We can't go beyond that. Otherwise, it's going to cause inflation, hyperinflation, Zimbabwe, Weimar Republic, you know the rest of the story. And what MMT is saying essentially is that the spending capacity of the federal government is actually much larger than that. It's not unlimited, and I usually say it twice, it's not unlimited, but it's much larger than that. And here's what we usually mean when we say it's larger than that. Not sure why this slides, there you go. So that additional spending capacity space that MMT is talking about here, this yellow space, is limited by the risk of inflation. And to me, the risk of inflation and what determines the inflation risk, oops, sorry about that. I thought I had it in these slides, but it's the wrong slides, obviously. What determines the risk of inflation from an MMT perspective are two things. One is the productive capacity. When we have a shortage of productive capacity, meaning machinery, equipment, technology, skilled labor, when we run out of resources and we decide to continue spending on that in that area, prices will start going up. The nice thing about that risk of inflation is that it's manageable. It's something that can actually create millions of new jobs. So resources are producible. We can produce more machines. We can develop better technology. We can train more people so that we increase the fiscal policy space. In other words, this yellow space here, if I was better at producing visuals, I would make this yellow space stretch into a longer space if we're successful at producing a larger amount of productive capacity. So that risk of inflation, we know how to deal with industrial policy, with strategic planning. The second risk of inflation has to do with market power. In other words, we have key players in the economy who can raise prices simply because they can. In other words, think of big pharma, think of the fossil fuel industry, think of mining companies, think of companies that can dominate their market and control prices, administer prices. And that type of inflation is not going to go away with austerity. It's not going to go away with less fiscal spending. It can only be eliminated or tamed by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. And this becomes a question of democracy. This becomes a question of corruption, essentially, when you have large interest groups from these industries influencing politics via campaign contributions, advertising, propaganda, whatever you want to call it. That hinders the democratic process, and that shrinks our fiscal policy space. So that yellow space that you see there can actually shrink with more market concentration. So what MMT is saying, when we say MMT is a description of the system, this is what we mean. It's a lens that tells us, wait a minute, there's an additional spending space here that we're not tapping into because we fear inflation. And the mainstream tells us that inflation happens with any kind of government spending or government deficit. And MMT is saying, has been saying for a long time, not necessarily. Additional quote unquote borrowing, additional national debt, larger deficits don't necessarily cause inflation, don't necessarily force interest rates to go up. And that's what we've been discovering over the last 10, 15 years all over the world. And now finally the mainstream is discovering this. So we just want them to discover this additional piece here of this additional spending capacity that governments have. So this is a general framework. The question then becomes, is this something that every government on the planet can do? And the answer is no. Different countries have different degrees of monetary sovereignty or different levels of spending capacity, determined by their productive capacity and determined by the level of market concentration or price setting behavior that domestic or foreign companies have in that particular country. So that means you can build a spectrum on which you can place countries. Some countries will have very high degrees of monetary sovereignty, like the US, like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Japan, and so on. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have countries with very weak degrees of monetary sovereignty, primarily because they have a lot of external debt. In some cases, because they don't even have a national currency, because they dollarize their economy or quasi-dollarize their economy by pegging their exchange rate to the dollar, to the euro, and so on. So what I want to talk about today is on that spectrum of monetary sovereignty with different countries around the planet with different degrees of spending capacity, there's going to be different levels of commitment and capabilities to tackle climate change and to implement Green New Deals all over the planet. So the countries like the US, like Australia, definitely have the spending capacity to start a Green New Deal and should have started years ago, decades ago. Countries in the global South in particular don't necessarily have that capacity. And that becomes a problem for us who care about climate change, who care about implementing a Green New Deal. How can we get the rest of the planet to participate? Because climate change is global. It's not just a problem for the US and Australia and Canada. And global inequality, I just said it, it's global. It's not just in the US, it's not just in the Western world. There's inequality within countries, and socioeconomic exclusion is also a global phenomenon that we've been experiencing, and that's, I think, is making a comeback, comeback with the revenge, so to speak. And that's what the Green New Deal framework is about. It's about decarbonizing the economy. It's about addressing inequality. It's about addressing socioeconomic exclusion. So a global Green New Deal requires the participation of all countries. So then the question becomes, how do we create a financing mechanism that doesn't rely on more external debt, that doesn't rely on a handful of countries producing all the technology and then selling it, even at a discount, to developing countries? And that's really the framework that I'd like to outline today. So a few data points just to know how we got here and what the extent of the problem is. This is what I call, when I think of the global system today, I think of a system of neo-colonial extraction of wealth from the global South. So to explain this graph in simple terms, if you take the entire world and divide countries into two groups, let's call them the global South, the rich countries, and let's call them the global South, developing countries, and global North, rich countries. And if you net out all the transactions of all the financial flows, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, loan payments, interest payments, charity, remittances from workers, everything, you net out all the transactions at the end of the year, the latest data we have, we have about $2 trillion. If you look at the green line here, right around 2017-ish, I think is the last data point we have. We're looking at a negative flow of $2 trillion annually extracted from the global south to the global north. That is unsustainable. When I first started, studying this and paying attention to this, the numbers were so small, relatively speaking. It was right around this time when I started to pay attention to it, around 2000, 2001. It was $500 billion a year, and we were freaking out. And look at where we are today. 20 years later, we're looking at $2 trillion annually extracted from the global south. There is no way that we can tackle climate change or socioeconomic exclusion in the global south with the mechanism that constantly extracts wealth and resources from the global south. So this here is a big problem. It's a structural problem. It's not going away unless we do something to reverse it. If anything, we want this green line to go above zero and to grow above zero if we're hoping to rebalance the global economy and rebalance opportunities for people on this planet. So this is a big problem, and it's not going to go away with just the Green New Deal in the US and Canada and Australia and add the whole of Europe and Japan. This needs to go away. So I'll propose a mechanism to do that. So that's data point number one. Data point number two, global income distribution. Many people have seen this champagne glass distribution, extreme concentration of wealth for the top 10%. You can go to the top 1%. You've seen this picture before, probably at the national level. This is global. This is unsustainable economically, politically, ethically, and ecologically, to be honest. And to add the ecological dimension to it, this is almost like a mirror image of the first picture, which has to do with CO2 emissions by world population. And it turns out that the richest 10% we just looked at essentially are responsible for almost 50% of CO2 emissions. So it's the same sort of champagne glass shape of global inequality, amplified by CO2 emissions. So it's interesting to put these two things together. The richest are responsible for a huge proportion of climate change. So let's put that on the board and come back to it in a second. When you look at CO2 emissions by country, not by wealth for individuals, it's the usual suspects. It's typically more or less the global north plus China, India, Brazil, a few developing countries that are kind of the BRICS countries that are rising in terms of their size in the global economy, and as a result in terms of their CO2 emission. But if you look at historical CO2 emission with the Industrial Revolution, it's typically the global north, excluding those BRICS countries. So this picture is sort of misleading too, because it doesn't really tell us who's responsible for demanding output that creates that CO2 emission. In other words, who's consuming this stuff? So when you look at the carbon footprint based on consumption patterns, then you get a more realistic picture. The US being the largest, followed by Canada, South Korea, and so on. So that gives us a more nuanced view of who's really responsible for the carbon footprint. And then when you track this historically, obviously you go back to the Industrial Revolution, it's exclusively European and countries, the global north countries. Again, China, India, and so on, these are countries that recently joined the global north in CO2 emissions and massive CO2 emissions and so on. In terms of the cumulative CO2 emissions, historically, and this is what matters. You look at Japan here as the purple line. India is a recent newcomer, and China obviously is a massive newcomer. And if we stay on the current path, right, we're at 2020 right here. The US is still the largest, right? And China is coming up next and exceeding Europe as of this year, I suppose, or soon, and is on an extremely unsustainable path. So we can't have this if we want to have a livable planet. We can't have this blue line continuing in this direction. So these are the trends that we want to reverse. So a couple of concepts that some people are familiar with. One is called the carbon bubble. The other one is called stranded assets, and these are related concepts. It's estimated that the carbon bubble globally is about $20 trillion. So what's this carbon bubble? Most people understand what financial market bubbles are. It's when you have financial assets that are overvalued, right? And then people discover their true value, and you have a market crash, and then you have a recession or a Great Depression because of that. Well, what we're talking about here is a carbon bubble, meaning financial assets that are overvalued because investors, because market players are not taking into account the climate risk. And gradually, in the last few years, we've seen some Wall Street analysts, some even central banks starting to pay attention to this and saying, wait a minute, there's all of these assets that are valuable today, but with the impact of climate change, they'll be worth nothing. And then we're going to have a crash. So I'll give you an example. Think of all the coastal properties, hotels, resorts, casinos, you name it, that are worth trillions of dollars all over the world. What happens when those properties are flooded, when that territory is essentially uninhabitable? What's going to be the value of those hotels, of those casinos, of those real estate properties? It's going to turn into nothing, zero, right? Think of when the time comes, and hopefully soon, when we transition to renewable energy, when we move away from fossil fuel extraction, what's going to be the value of all the industrial equipment, the drilling and the transportation infrastructure and the storage infrastructure for oil and gas when we transition to solar and geothermal and so on? The value of the trillions of dollars worth of assets will become stranded assets. In other words, worth nothing, right? So the $20 trillion is the modest estimate. I've seen estimates putting it up to $30 trillion. We don't know exactly. We don't know when exactly this is going to crash, but we know it's coming, right? And gradually, investors are paying attention to this. Just in the oil and gas industry, we're talking about at least $1, if not $4 trillion, depending on the estimates, worth of stranded assets. In the US alone, there's a study focused on real estate just in coastal cities. And there's already an estimate of $1 trillion worth of assets that will become stranded. So we're talking about a financial collapse of a dimension we've never seen in the history of the world. And that is coming. We know this is not in the distant future. Unless we start some really aggressive climate mitigation, something like a global Green New Deal, right? But can we afford it, right? Do we have the money to pay for this? Who's going to pay for it? How can the global South pay for this massive transition to decarbonizing the economy and so on? And I'd like to, just sketch the idea here in 3 bullet points, and then open it up to questions and conversations. The first point is the importance of climate reparations for a global Green New Deal. So in other words, you have developing countries with limited spending capacity, limited technological capabilities, and you have the global North with a large productive capacity, technological capabilities, and large spending capacity. We need a mechanism to transfer resources, both financial resources and technological resources, from the global North to the global South. Some people say we produce it and sell it for them. Some people say we produce it and sell it for them at a discount, or we lend them money so they can build their infrastructure. We're not going in that direction. We can't, because of the $2 trillion extraction mechanism that I showed you. We need to reverse that trend, because that's a major obstacle to any progress. So climate reparations, this is sort of a legal, moral, ethical, financial, economic argument to rebalance the global economy. In other words, remember the data point number 1 that I mentioned earlier? The global North is responsible for most CO2 emissions. The global South is suffering the consequences of that history of CO2 emissions and climate change. There's a case to be made for repairing the damage. And when I use the term reparations, think of it linguistically as in repairing a broken structure. So when we talk about reparations, there's three components in it, regardless of which framework for reparations in the context of the US or other countries. When we talk about reparations, there's three things. One is telling the truth about what happened. And this usually happens in some sort of truth and reconciliation commission, something like what we see after major genocides, like after apartheid in South Africa, or after the Arab Spring in Tunisia, or in Eastern Europe, and so on. So the purpose of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to recognize that some harm was inflicted upon a group of people, usually a large group of people in a country or in a region. It's not a court system where we're going to send somebody to prison at the end of the hearing or whatever. It's a way for the community, for the nation to heal together, to hear the truth, to hear the grievances, to acknowledge them, and to honor them, and to allow the nation or the region to heal and move on as a unit. This is what we need to do globally, a network of truth and reconciliation commissions where we hear the stories of indigenous people, of people who actually suffered the consequences of climate change, of extraction of natural resources from all over the world. So that's step number one, telling the truth. Number two is an apology, a public apology that acknowledges that somebody was responsible for the harm that was done. And number three is the actual repairing of the broken structure, which involves both a monetary compensation, but involves physically or technically repairing the mechanism that is malfunctioning. In this case, the mechanism that's malfunctioning is this colonial/neo-colonial extractive global financial architecture that we have. That needs to be repaired. And I'll come to it in the third bullet point here when I explain how we can design a global financial mechanism that can repair that broken structure. So climate reparations, meaning the global north, countries that are responsible for the vast majority of CO2 emissions, have a moral responsibility to repair the damage via monetary compensation. It starts with the basics, which is debt cancellation for developing countries, not debt forgiveness, right? I don't like that term. It's called debt cancellation. It involves transfer of technology. It involves research and development partnerships, true partnerships, not kind of shallow partnerships. So that's climate reparations. The next component of a global Green New Deal is what I call colonial reparations. And that means acknowledging, again, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, telling the truth, public apology, and then the repairing of the broken structures. So colonial reparations, I don't need to delve into this very much. I know for some reason it's still debatable for some reasons whether, colonial authorities did cause some damage, long-term damage to developing countries. I think people who read history closely and pay attention to what England has done to India and the rest of Africa, what France has done and continues to do in most of Africa, there's plenty of evidence that the model was dictatorial, was brutal, was genocidal in some cases, and was extractive by design. And that after the years of colonialism ended and we started the years of independence, those structures remained pretty much in place in what we call neo-colonial extraction. So the damage that was done to the global South is deserving of colonial reparations. Again, reparations in the form of transfer of, number one, canceling the debt. Number two, transfer of financial resources to help us decarbonize and build a new socioeconomic fabric. And number three, again, transfer of technology and transfer of resources to accelerate the implementation of a global Green New Deal. And then finally, the financial, global financial mechanism that I think would be ideal for setting up this reparations framework is something that I obviously did not invent. It's Keynes's old International Clearing Union, or Bancor program, by which essentially Keynes in 1945 proposed creating an automatic stabilizer at the global level that allows countries that consistently have trade deficits and as a result are consistently forced either into currency depreciation, which creates chaos and socioeconomic exclusion, or accumulation of external debt denominated in dollars and euros and British pounds and so on, which creates the cycle of external debt and the cycle of extraction and of lack of monetary sovereignty. So Keynes's proposal at the time was, as a planet, we can't have all countries be trade surplus countries. It's just impossible unless we trade with a different planet. So we're always going to have a group of countries that will constantly have trade deficits, that will constantly be forced into austerity, and as a result will not be able to achieve domestic full employment, and will be forced to either force their population into poverty and starvation if they let their exchange rate devalue, or be forced into subordination to the global north by accumulating large amounts of unsustainable external debts. So Keynes's idea is have an international, sort of think of it as an international central bank with an international unit of account that can be taken from, credits are taken from trade surplus countries and allocated to countries that need them the most, the global South in particular, in order to help them achieve domestic full employment, in order to avoid the accumulation of external debt, in order to avoid austerity. Well, if what we're talking about here is acceptable to you, my friends, which is climate reparations and colonial reparations, we already have a mechanism whereby the global north is going to transfer a massive amount of financial resources, which essentially happens to coincide exactly with Keynes's proposal for an international clearing union. The problem with Keynes's proposal back then was it was never going to be politically feasible. Some country was always going to oppose it. It's going to be the biggest trade surplus countries. At the time in 1945, it was the US that was clearly emerging from World War II as the only major powerhouse for industrial production, because Europe was destroyed and Japan was destroyed. And as a result, the US was clearly going to be the big trade surplus country for the foreseeable future, which was the case. So the US didn't want an international organization taking its trade surplus and allocating it to who knows who, right? So potential adversary of the US. Instead, the US practically implemented the Keynes plan under very tight restrictions, which is what the Marshall Plan was. The Marshall Plan essentially was a transfer of financial resources to rebuild Europe, but it was on US terms for countries that fell under sort of the US influence, right? It wasn't going to help developing countries or help the Soviet Union or anything like that, right? So what I'm proposing here, essentially using the Keynes proposal, but adding to it the legal and moral obligation that I'm presenting here for climate reparations and colonial reparations, and adding the ticking time bomb that we're all dealing with, which is, if there is any other framework to implement a global Green New Deal that you can convince me of, I'm happy to consider a second option. But everything I've seen so far is tax and spend, is incremental, doesn't produce any mechanism that reverses that trend, the $2 trillion moving in the opposite direction. I think Keynes's plan was the right plan from the beginning. It just didn't have the political weight to it at the time. And it's up to us today to create that political weight and to create the pressure. And that pressure can only happen if we acknowledge the damage that was done to the planet, to people in the global South, and the damage that continues to happen as we speak. This extractive nature of the global economy is unsustainable. So we either do it and do it big, as I say, go big or go home. And I think this is it. And we were joking before we went live on this live stream. And I'm an optimistic person in general, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this. But even optimistic people sometimes get, have their dark moments. And in my dark moments, The only thing that I hope for is that climate scientists are off. Not that they're wrong. I don't think they're wrong. That's not realistic. But I hope that they're off by 50, maybe 100 years to give us time to build a political movement globally to push for true transformative climate action under something like a global Green New Deal. And with that, I'm happy to take questions and open it up for questions and comments. Thank you again for being here and for this invitation.
Okay. Thank you, Fadhel. So I neglected to inform everyone. I think probably they already know, but that you are the Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University and a president of the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity, which is an institute that works very hard to this aim of the global Green New Deal. And I also just wanted to mention that last year you held the first African Monetary Sovereignty Conference in Tunis. Yes. And I guess start off the Q&A with a question about what sort of you did, that was in partnership with the Rosa Luxemburg Institute in Germany, but is there a growing number of organizations across the global south that you're aware of that are becoming more knowledgeable about macroeconomics and how they can use, just get interested in that?
So thank you for mentioning this, and I just plugged in the chat for people on YouTube. You can go to mes-africa.org, which is the website for the conference and for this movement that we're trying to build. And you'll find an open letter that many of you have signed, but if you haven't, please go ahead and sign it. It's available in 50 languages there. So this initiative for the conference started about 2 years ago. We thought, well, there's a handful of us who are interested in MMT in the global south and the African continent. We thought, well, we should start somewhere, right? Let's start with the conference. And we didn't really have big hopes for making a big splash all of a sudden, but we were blown away by the level of enthusiasm from the general public, from the labor movement, from environmental movement, for people who would normally be our allies, right? But they were stuck in a standard framework that says all of these things you want to fight for are great and are admirable, fights to win. The problem is, how are you going to pay for it? So to pay for it, you need to tax this to pay for that, or you need to borrow to pay for that. And good luck with that, right? If you're going to have the level of influence to tax the rich or to tax the corporations or whatever. And then we came in with this MMT framework that says, wait a minute, we're going to decouple these two things for you. Spending on national priorities, on health, on education, on infrastructure, on climate is important. Taxing the rich, taxing the corporation is important in and of itself, but not because we need their money or their permission to pay for a Green New Deal. We tax to reduce inequality. We tax to reduce their power and influence in politics. We reduce the power of the oligarchy. We tax oil companies because we want to decarbonize, not because we need their money or their permission. We tax Wall Street speculators not because we need their money or their permission, but because we want to reduce their influence in the economy and so on. So all of a sudden, you have people recognizing that we've been told a lie this whole time, that we need money from them specifically. So now we have an empowering framework that says, let's shine a bright light on how the mechanics of the system works, and let's figure out where we need to do the pushing, right? Do we push on taxing the rich? That's an important battle to fight. But at the same time, we should be pushing for climate action. We should be pushing for social justice, for other things. So the conference was sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in North Africa, and the Tunis office and the Dakar office, where my colleague Ndongo Sambasila is one of the research directors there. So when the pandemic started, we went back to the initial conference framework and said, well, we need to make a public statement about what the pandemic has exposed, which is essentially the key weaknesses that we've highlighted with this conference and with this book that we're editing, which will be coming out next year, hopefully. which is, this external debt is the root cause of the lack of monetary sovereignty for most countries in the global south, and that the source of this external debt is fundamentally the lack of food sovereignty, the lack of energy sovereignty, and an industrial policy that's been focused on low value added content of production. In other words, the outsourced jobs, quote unquote, from the US and Canada that become too obsolete and too basic in terms of their technological input. Those are the jobs that move to the global south, which means if you're a country that's receiving those jobs and those industries, you're essentially importing all the inputs, you're importing the technology, you're importing all the value added content, and you're using lower labor standards, lower environmental standards, cheap, wages, lower wages, to add a very small percentage of value added for export. So you end up importing high value added content, exporting low value added content. You're constantly in a trap. And that to a lot of people was eye-opening, and highlighted the importance of the structural solutions which require sustainable agriculture, which got the environmental movement and the sustainable agriculture movement fired up about why their work is so important. Number two, it's the opportunities in sustainable energy and renewable energy. And that's another way to plug that hole in your external debt problem. And then a recommitment to investing in education and public health, because that's the only way to get your industrial status upgraded from low value added content to high value added content. You need education, infrastructure, public health, research and development, technical training, so you can become more selective in attracting companies to your industry, and you become able to build more resilience so you can produce more domestically, more value added domestically.
Mm. And before I hand it over to Marcus, who will moderate the Q&A, I just wanted to actually, which is something that we should be more in the habit of doing at Modern Money Australia, but I wanted to acknowledge that I live and I'm working on the land of the Wongal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I acknowledge the elders past and present, and their land was never ceded. And I recognize that with white settlement, there has been devastation wrought on their communities, and it has been ongoing for since colonization. And I also recognize Australia's involved in a lot of destruction of Indigenous communities beyond our borders as well, in terms of our trade policy, our foreign aid policy. So your work is incredibly important in helping me to see how we can help them to help the communities, Indigenous communities, become more empowered and enable self-determination. And
on this particular point of reparations, the traditional literature on reparations, not the nascent MMT literature on reparations. I think MMT brings a very important and empowering shift, which is the following. In the traditional literature, we're told that yes, reparations are important, but how are we going to pay for it? It's going to have to be taxing somebody, right? Or borrowing from somebody in order to pay financial reparations. MMT says, wait a minute, you don't need to tax the entire population or a specific subgroup of the population to do this, because the government has the spending capacity to repair the damage. So it's an acknowledgement of a national responsibility towards Indigenous people and so on. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be taxing anybody, but it's the decoupling of the two. So now if we want to create that additional fiscal spending space, how do we do it? That yellow space that I showed in my low quality visual with my limited visual aids capabilities, that yellow space to increase the spending capacity, well, there's a couple of things you can do. One is to tax and regulate the power of price setters in the system that allows you to increase your spending capacity. Number two you spend in strategic areas so that you increase your productive capacity. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're going to pay indigenous people reparations in the amount of X, dollars. We'll figure out the amounts. The question is, how will that money be spent? Well, there's going to be increased demand for housing. There's going to be increased demand for education. There's going to be increased demand for health services and so on. So let's focus on just housing, right? Housing and energy. Well, do we have enough productive capacity for 1 million people to buy new homes and decent quality of life and so on? If we have that productive capacity, then that amount of reparations will not be inflationary. But if we know for a fact that we have a shortage of reasonable quality, standard middle-class housing and so on, then before we even disperse the reparations, we have to simultaneously commit the resources to build new housing units, to train construction workers so that we create, the jobs that will actually provide the physical productive resources that people will be buying with the reparations financial resources, which is a great thing. It's a win-win for everybody. We repair the damage, we acknowledge the pain that was caused to indigenous people, and we repair the damage in a generous way. And at the same time, we create millions of jobs to build a better future for everybody. And if that means also taxing and regulating the power of the telecom companies, of the fossil fuel companies, that's even a better win for everybody, right? Whereas the standard mainstream literature on reparations, it says, well, we can't be generous with reparations unless we get the money from these billionaires. And then the billionaires will convince everybody, well, I didn't cause any of that damage. Why are you going after me? I'm the one creating jobs for you. And then we say, oh, sorry, we didn't really mean to. And then we're back to the status quo.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks. I'll hand it over to Marcus now, and I'll hide away while Marcus leads the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fadhel.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Fadhel, for your fantastic presentation. We have got quite a few questions that are lining up.
Okay.
One, I think you've essentially answered during your presentation, but Wayne McMillan and Wayne, if they're here, Wayne, if you want to post in chat if you want me to outline this question for you, or if you're happy to ask Fadhel yourself. Just seeing if a response from Wayne. That's all right. I'll take it up. So he's saying, how can resource-constrained developing nations deal with climate change effectively? And there is a follow-up one as well, which I'll ask around a related topic. But is there anything further you want to add to this, given that you've had a bit of a discussion about it regardless?
Yeah, I think the main point is that they have limited technological capabilities, limited degree of monetary sovereignty. And the only way to do this on a global scale is through reparations. And reparations needs to be directed towards building resilience in the food industry, building resilience in the renewable energy, domestic renewable energy production, and building resilience in the sense of investing in education and research and development, and so that you raise the standard of living and technological capabilities in the global south. But it has to be accelerated because we only have 10 years to take this massive action. So there has to be immediate transfer of technological capabilities to the global south.
Yeah, thank you.
And debt cancellation, obviously. The whole thing starts with debt cancellation right away.
Funny you should mention that. Actually, nice segue into, there's been a couple of questions around this, so I might jump to these. So Wayne and others have brought up, what is your thinking about a global debt jubilee, a la what Steve Keen and Michael Hudson have talked about, obviously?
Sure.
And as part of that, because it's linked, is potentially what are the new international organizations that might be necessary or needed in order to achieve that reparations and global debt jubilee?
Yeah. So we have obviously all the work of Hudson and Keen on this, which I'll second. What I'll add to this is that we already have legal mechanisms for debt cancellations that have been used in the past, but only exclusively with the political weight of the US or the UK. So there's something called the odious debt doctrine, which was established almost 100 years ago by a Russian-born French legal scholar by the name of Alexander Sachs, I believe. And this debt cancellation mechanism essentially requires three elements. Number one, that the debt was given to a country without the consent of the people. In other words, if you have a dictator borrowing money. Number two, if the debt didn't benefit the people, which applies in many dictatorship countries, military, or maldistribution of resources. And number three, if the lenders knew about this, then the debt is declared odious and should be canceled. And that has been used before. Costa Rica canceled its debt based on this. The Iraqi debt after the US invasion was canceled based on this principle. It wasn't a debt to the US, it happened to be debt to Eastern European countries. So we've used this, and there's a whole bunch of countries, developing countries, that would qualify for immediate debt cancellation for this. And I'll give you an example. And Tunisia was one of those after the Arab Spring. And there was a movement within the Tunisian government. Some MPs were trying to push for debt cancellation from the dictatorship years. And the other MPs behind closed doors mostly acknowledged and said, yes, we can actually do this. We have the legal right to push for debt cancellation, at least partial debt cancellation. But then here's what they said next. But we shouldn't do it. You know why? Because we'll be embarrassing our European friends and calling them out on supporting dictatorship. And we can't do that because we need them. Why do we need them? Because we need to export our stuff to them. We need to borrow more money for them to rebuild the country. So they're trapped in this model of neo-colonial extractive. They're acknowledging essentially that there is no other alternative. Even though we can cancel some of the debt, there'll be, the political repercussions will not be in our favor. So they decided to let it go. So I acknowledge all of these political and geopolitical things, and that's why we're not going to be able to do this by counting on a few MPs and well-meaning presidents and prime ministers, no matter how progressive they are, if we don't have mobilized people all over the world who know the truth, who are empowered with knowledge like this, who can do the pushing. Right? Even FDR, and this is a famous line from FDR during the 1930s, where when you convince him of something, Social Security or the importance of the New Deal or something like that, he would say, "You've convinced me. Now make me do it." In other words, get me a political mass, a social movement that forces the direction of the country in this way. And I think this is what I'm hoping to contribute to is bringing this to the masses. And what I'm proposing today, I'm not naive. This is not going to happen tomorrow just because some enlightened person at the UN decides, well, this is a great idea, let's do it. It's never going to happen unless we have a global solidarity political movement that pushes for this. We're going to get crumbs left and right for climate change, for maybe we'll get some colonial reparations, maybe some debt relief here and there, and they'll make you beg for it and say sorry that we embarrassed you, and we're not going anywhere. So that's my.
So there's another two questions that are related to this, so I might jump to them from Jerry.
Hi, Jerry.
Andrew. I hope they don't mind if I speak on their behalf, because it's a sort of a related question to what we've just been discussing. So one of them from Jerry is, we've made a lot of great bullet points and about the political feasibility of what you've been proposing, obviously, and given the capitalist structure, the monopoly capitalist interests, will they be willing to give up all of these stranded assets and pay for those reparations? But there's a one that's also related to that, is that Andrew says, I thought the IMF was set up to provide the balancing function and got co-opted, and of course the World Bank to provide funds, and it's part of the process. So if you could comment on both those sorts of institutions that have now and perhaps were set up to try and alleviate these sorts of things, but also, as you've already touched on, some of those bigger constraints, let's say political constraints and financial constraints to this whole proposal.
If I may start with the second question, and then I'll go back to Jerry's question, because it's It's an important one. So in terms of the IMF being co-opted and so on, the IMF was created in 1945 in the Bretton Woods agreements. 1945, most of the global South was colonized. So number one, they were not at the table. They were not invited to New Hampshire.
That's a very good point on that one.
It was the colonial authorities that established the system, and the system wasn't really to rebalance the global economy to help the global South. It was to rebuild Europe and make sure that the financial clashes that were happening in Europe, in particular, in between the two wars, don't re-emerge. But by the time you get to the mid-1960s and early 70s, most of the global South is independent, quote unquote independent, and the IMF was not there to help. The IMF is part of the problem today. That doesn't mean that the IMF couldn't, change and play a new role of the Keynes kind, of the Keynes proposal kind. But, how is that going to happen? Who dominates the IMF? Who has the veto majority vote based on the IMF charter? Is the United States. So the US is unlikely to do this on its own, even with the most enlightened president. That's why we have to have a global movement. So transitioning into Jerry's question about the likelihood of the resistance from the capitalist monopoly power and influence. I mean, I hope that it was at least nuanced in my presentation, that I acknowledge that we're not going to get that larger fiscal spending capacity either for reparations or a New Deal or anything unless we push back against that inflation limit, which I said has two components, an easy one and a difficult one. The easy one is strategic investment in increasing productive capacity, creating millions of jobs, investing in new technology. That's the easy one. Everybody supports that. The difficult one is the power structure, the abusive price-setting behavior, the corrupt dominance of corporations in countries around the planet. And here, let me emphasize this just to acknowledge that this is important. So I'm not saying that we can do this immediately, but I'm saying the only way to do it is to have very powerful pitchforks going after these vested interests, and not just very powerful pitchforks, well-informed pitchforks, because we've seen revolutions in many, many parts of the world, in Tunisia and Lebanon and other places, and they end up, unfortunately, going nowhere. Why? Because we get rid of the corrupt politicians and the corrupt, business people. We put them in prison, and then we elect a new government, brought to you by the revolution. And then what does that new government do? They go back to the same exact practices. Now with a little bit of transparency and with democracy and with freedom of speech and everything, which is what we have in Tunisia. But it's the exact same extractive structure, extractive mechanisms, building a new class of powerful business elites, domestic and international. So when I say well-informed pitchforks, it's not just to replace the existing, elected officials and business, oligarchs and so on, is to undo the structures behind those individuals, right? And I think MMT provides this framework. So now we have a framework for taxing and regulating their power out of existence, as opposed to taxing some of their wealth to, for minor improvements in people's quality of life for a number of years, and then going back to the same extractive structures. I'll give you a specific example because a lot of people, they throw the words corruption kind of vaguely, but it's very important to the MMT framework, to what we're trying to do here. So let's say it's a developing country, and you have a nascent movement of people who understand this with these little pitchforks, well-informed MMT pitchforks. And then they say, we want to build food resilience and renewable energy resilience. We want to support local independent farmers and renewable energy production. And we want the government to support this. And we're going to start electing MPs or presidents who would support this type of investment. Now, if I'm the only one in the country with an exclusive import license to bring wheat or rice to the country, to feed the country, which is what happens in developing countries, you have an exclusive import license because you're too close to the president or the military or whatever, and that's the power of corruption. Now, why would I want these guys to create domestic competition for me. I'm going to support academic research to prove that they're wrong. I'm going to, run a media campaign against their efforts. I'm going to bribe politicians to make them go away. And that's the nice way to do it. In some countries, people get killed for trying to challenge the power of the oligarchs and their business supporters. So that's what I'm talking about, Jerry. And thank you for bringing this question, which means those pitchforks, if they're going to their MPs and asking for support for sustainable agriculture and renewable energy, and they're not prepared for the fight, and they're not shining the bright light and naming people and building a social movement that mobilizes well-informed people to push back against those vested interests, I don't think those fights are going to go anywhere. So it's going to be a hell of a fight, but your chances of pushing back against those vested interests are many times over greater and stronger if you have a clear vision of what the alternative looks like and what the obstacles are like. But unfortunately, many of our friends on the left, they just throw this, oh, the capitalists will never let us do it. Well, okay, so how do you do it? By pitchforks that are just people, starting a revolution, but not knowing what the alternative is and what the real obstacles is. They usually see the real obstacle is the police, because they're the guys beating us on the streets, or it's the corrupt guy in the prime minister's office. They don't recognize that the real obstacles are corporate interests that are very specific and they're different in different countries. And it's not always geopolitical foreign. We're talking about domestic price setters and price abusers. If you add to it the global dimension, then we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. A very important point that the corruption comes in different ways and can be within as well, right? So the next three, there's three questions all around two high-level ones around MMT more broadly, and there's a specific one related to that. So I think we'll go to that, seeing as you're talking about MMT as a lens. So the first one is, under MMT-informed fiscal policy, is there any reason for governments to borrow money? And the second part of that one is, it wasn't entirely clear to Leon how the Keynesian mechanism is informed by MMT. So firstly, if you address the borrowing of money, and the second one around the Keynesian mechanism you're talking about, how that's informed by MMT.
Yeah, the Keynes International Clearing Union mechanism is not related to MMT. It's just a part of the literature that many of us in the post-Keynesian tradition have been advocating for, working on for years, but always bump against the political reality of there's going to be a whole bunch of countries who will oppose it, and we've seen this during the global financial crisis and so on. What I think the MMT framework brings to the Keynes proposal is the argument, the legal and moral and ethical case for reparations. And then the Keynes mechanism is there to provide the kind of the hardware to distribute financial resources globally, or rebalance financial resources globally. The first question, I forget who asked the question, but the first question about, does the government need to borrow in order to spend? Am I recalling the question correctly?
So it was, sorry, I'm just going to go back to it. Under an MMT-informed fiscal policy, is there any reason for governments to borrow money?
So from an MMT framework, we wouldn't call it borrowing the same way you and I borrow from a bank. So when the government is selling treasury bonds or government bonds, that's what we colloquially call borrowing, and people in the mainstream of the economics profession call it government borrowing. But why would the government need to borrow its own money, right? Which is an interesting way to look at it. But the question is, why do governments do it? And is it necessary, right? So when you think of extreme examples, like the US entering World War II, for example, after the Great Depression, which is the most miserable time in US history, and then going into this massive spending mode to build for the war effort for World War II in 1940, 41, 42. where did the money come from? There was no money to be taxed during the Great Depression. There was no money to be borrowed during the Great Depression. So there was some quote unquote borrowing that happened, but it happened during the war, not before the war. So it wasn't there to pay for the war. Paying for the war was 535 elected officials in Washington, D.C. got together and approved the war spending. So spending money into existence, as we always say, which is the power of the purse that the US Congress has constitutionally. That spending of money into existence went into paying wages for workers to build tanks and airplanes and so on for the war effort. And it's a free country, right? So those workers now are free to go home and spend their money on buying new cars and new homes and doing whatever they want. That would have been a problem. Why? Because the US didn't have any significant level of productive capacity to spare for producing consumer goods. So those workers would have been causing an inflation spiral in the US because they'll be bidding up the price of homes and new cars and so on. There were no new cars to buy anyway. The entire city of Detroit shut down automobile production with the exception of Jeeps, I think, and vans. So there were no new cars to buy. So what did the US Treasury do at the time to tame that risk of inflation? Well, there's a number of things, but one of them was selling freedom bonds or selling war bonds. And there was a huge marketing campaign. You can Google these things and see beautiful pictures of those war bonds and posters promoting, essentially leveraging the patriotic mood of the nation to defeat Nazis, and essentially saying, you hardworking citizens helping us build these tanks and airplanes, we want you to postpone your consumption until after the war. So give us those $10,000. Here's a piece of paper called US Treasury bond, freedom bond, save it. And then 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when the war is over, we'll pay you back plus interest, right? So the quote unquote borrowing wasn't to fund the war. Borrowing was to stabilize interest rates, to stabilize inflation, and so on. So that's the biggest example that gives us a historical kind of overview of how federal government finances work. And it's not the only time. That's how federal finances always work. It's just we have it backwards. We see the borrowing and spending happening at the same time. And we hear politicians always saying, oh, we need to borrow so we can build this new thing. And then we remember the household analogy, your local municipality, which cannot spend without borrowing, cannot spend without taxing. And then we confuse the two, conflate the two. So I hope this is helpful.
No, look, thank you for that. And just a brief aside, MMT podcast has a couple of excellent episodes addressing how the US and other countries paid for World War II. Well worth listening into. There's a lot of fantastic detail there. Okay, so next question, actually the first question is from Darren. It has a few dimensions to it, but basically it's a bit more detail on MMT. So the gist of it is that you may or may not be aware, I'm sure you are, the newest country to our north, Timor-Leste, went through a very difficult period of becoming a new nation. And Bill Mitchell has suggested that they should, a few years ago, that they should issue their own currency. And as I understand it, or as Darren has said, that they've instead issued, they've pegged their currency to the US dollar. He then goes on to say, however, you also say that currency sovereignty is something that you earn over time by becoming food and energy sovereign. And Darren's suggesting that these two suggestions, from Bill to just issue the currency and from yourself to build that over time, seem a little contradictory. Can you clarify that or discuss that a little bit further?
Yeah, I wouldn't see them as contradictory. There's no reason to start with dollarization and then start building the resilience, because once you do that, you're already trapped on day one. You're not going to be able to build the resilience. But it's equally, I don't know what the word is, it's equally deficient if you start your own new currency, but don't have an economic development strategy to maintain your monetary sovereignty and to strengthen it and to build resilience. So you have to put all of these things in place at the same time. And for small island nations, and I've been talking to a number of really small developing countries, Pacific islands and others, who are paying attention to this because they recognize this, they live this, especially they live the impact of climate change, and with the pandemic over the last few months, essentially bringing the entire global supply chain to a halt. The excessive isolation from the global economy has just put the bright light on these structural weaknesses. So a lot of countries are turning to MMT ideas, the concept of monetary and economic sovereignty, to think about how they can build that resilience. And it's not something you snap your finger and you declare monetary sovereignty. It's something, as I said, that you earn by strategically investing in areas where you need to build resilience. So I don't know if this is satisfactory enough.
Sure. I think Darren is still with us at the moment. If you want to put anything in chat as to whether that's covered off anything, but it certainly sounds so. I mean, I guess in summary, what you're saying is those two positions, there's more context, right? And one and the other support each other is really what we're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think Bill was suggesting that they should have their own currency and then just follow the standard economic policy advice from neoliberals.
Indeed, and I note that a link to a Bill presentation on this subject has also been put into the chat as well, so people can follow up on that. The next question is from Andrew Zerner, and please excuse if I've mucked up your name terribly. Andrew, did you want to ask your question directly, or are you happy for me to do that? Just see if you post some chat there. I'll say it on his behalf. So he first off puts in a little bit of context. He says Australia is a mid-global power, and assumed would be classed as being a global north. However, our country is built on constant extraction of resources. A minor proportion is for the benefit of the country, while a lot of it goes into corporations and not for the benefit of the people, and so on. The question is, Australia's status as a powerful country, is it unusual in the sense that it's a country whose economy and history is largely based on extraction of its resources, rather than say like US or Europe and so on, with a lot of their own manufacturing prowess and sovereignty and so on. Did you want to make a comment on that in terms of, is Australia a bit unusual in that regard?
No, I don't think it's unusual. If you look at the history of the U.S., which was a colony too in the beginning, it was extractive, it was abusive. I mean, decades of slavery and extraction of resources and destruction of wealth for indigenous communities. But the U.S., transitioned rapidly, relatively rapidly, especially after World War II, to its manufacturing and high value-added content capabilities. But that a country cannot achieve that without investment in research and development and infrastructure and education and public health. And we know from recent history that countries that slow down, even advanced countries that slow down on investment in those areas, they start to fall behind, the US included in this case. So we know what works and we know what doesn't. On Australia being relying heavily on mining and extractive industries. Australia is a continent that's vastly underpopulated, which makes it interesting when you read about the news about immigration related to Australia. But the interesting thing as an outsider that I see is I like to see the possibilities, which is, let's talk about renewable energy, for example, the possibilities. If we take the existing renewable energy technology and capabilities and we try to scale this up to a global level for something like a global Green New Deal, we're doomed because of all the mining, impact on the ecology, on indigenous people all over the world. will be massive. So there's an urgent need for a major component of a Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal for investing in research and development in material science, so that we move away from, all the, what are we going to do with all the poisonous stuff in these solar panels that we have today? These are the most efficient, highest quality ones. In 30 years, when they become obsolete, what are we going to do with the toxic stuff? We don't even have recycling infrastructure or any mechanism, workable mechanism right now for something like a circular economy, right? And that has to be a major component of a global Green New Deal. So for a country like Australia, if we think long-term about where the future of renewable energy is and where mining is, Australia should be leading the world in research and development and material science and innovation to minimize the extractive nature of its own economy and to gear up its own position to be a world leader in technological innovation for renewable energy and for sustainable agriculture. So a call to action for Australia. I mean, the advantage that you have is amazing and can be leveraged for the rest of the world.
Yeah, look, totally agree on that one. There are two questions coming up around China, so we'll look at those next. But right now, Andrew's had his hand up, so I'll hand over to him and he'll discuss what his question is. Andrew, you're there. You might have to.
Hi, Andrew.
Here I am.
Excellent. Andrew, go ahead.
I'll be brief, but you have nailed the big problem, which is you talk about informed pitchforks.
Yes.
So our challenge is to, and this is something I'm working on, which I'm taking the opportunity, our challenge is to catalyze a movement of citizen educators, get folks talking to people they know about MMT, about the environmental issues, all of that, in a way that people understand why we need transformative change and the general nature of it in order to have the public will for the changes we need. I've set up a platform for that. It's called inspiringtransition.net.
Mm-hmm. If you could put that in the chat for people to see it and visit the website, that'll be great.
Sure, good.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. By all means, put it into the chat and people can follow up on that.
That's absolutely important. I mean, the reason I dedicate so much of my time to doing these webinars and presentations is really I'm not really speaking to my academic colleagues. With all due respect, they're not going to change the world. We need the masses. So I spend quite a bit of my time working with citizens groups who are interested in these issues, but they've been, backed against the wall, cornered with the mainstream narrative that says you can't have all of that at once. You can only have little crumbs, one at a time, because we don't have the money. And if we try to spend on all of these things that you're asking for, we're going to bankrupt the country and all the rest of the story. But when I present the MMT view, pre-pandemic, when I can see people in an audience, halfway through the presentation, you see people's eyes going like this, and you can sense both the anger and the enthusiasm and the hope in their eyes. And I usually hear it during the Q&A. The anger in the sense, how could they have lied to us this whole time? And the sense of hope and opportunity and possibilities, knowing that a better world is within reach. We're not talking about an impossible thing here, but then they're empowered, knowing, again, those well-informed pitchforks, as I said. Now they're empowered and have a clear view of what the real obstacles are and what the possibilities are and what the real constraints are. And now they can call their bluff when they're told that they can't have this, that, or the other. They can push back against that narrative and inform their friends and their neighbors and build these social movements.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Fadhel, for that. And thank you, Andrew, for the post as well. The next two questions are around China, which is why I'll put them together. One from Sue and one from Sue Dixon, one from Wayne McMillan. So the first one is, do you see China as an important player in bringing about
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part. Can you say it again?
Certainly. Do you see China as an important player in bringing new, more democratic international organizations? And there's a second one, but perhaps start on that one first, because the second one also has a piece around the China as a global player. Because I mean, China's a really interesting situation. It's a huge, as you had during your presentation, it's obviously a big contributor to the problem. It's also potentially doing a lot to address it, but it's also a country that has a lot of challenges from a Western democracy viewpoint, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
China is an interesting case here because it's a rising superpower economically, and obviously it has ambitions. So far, those ambitions are tamed because I think the Chinese government is realistic about its capabilities. But I honestly can't imagine China taking the lead in implementing something like a global Green New Deal. It's hard to do this without truly acknowledging the importance of the democratic process. I mean, the idea of sort of a benevolent dictator type of framework is not something that I usually embrace. So I don't know how to answer the question. The short answer is no. But I'm an optimistic person, so maybe there is this next phase in the role of China as a key player in the global economy. For example, the areas that give me hope is the possibility of China, because of its interest in kind of playing the role of maybe the counterweight for U.S. imperialism via the BRICS, counterweight, which was the reason for creating that group. Maybe it can provide an alternative path for economic development away from the IMF and World Bank austerity framework. Yes, there's hope there, but I'll believe it when I see it. Maybe there is a framework for technological transfer and technological partnership with the global South to rapidly decarbonize. There's lots of possibilities there, but I'll believe it when I see it. So far, it's still, China's partnership with the global South is primarily to access resources that are needed for China's industrial, to fuel China's industrial capabilities. It's not the same neo-colonial or colonial relationship that, say, Europe had with Africa in the past, but it has the potential of being just as bad. Lots of ifs. Yeah.
Look, agree. And just on that, I'm not sure how different it really is to how Europe's done in the past, frankly. But yeah, the point being is the motives are unclear. And will it just be an extension of that very bad history that's already we've discussed?
Well, right? Here's an interesting way to look at it. If you take the Western world, Western Europe and the United States and Australia, and these are countries that are, on paper, democratic, we have resilient democratic institutions, we care about human rights, we care about justice, we care about all of those beautiful things listed in the Constitution, and yet we do all this damage to the rest of the world.
It's a very good point.
Can you imagine, a non-democratic, superpower rising to dominate the global economy? What do you expect of it?
Who are
something
also
better? I don't know. Maybe.
And let's be clear, they're pulling that nationalistic lever pretty heavily too, right? So that's not a good sign. Anyway, I am conscious, Fadhel, that we're coming up to.
It's lunchtime, your time.
Getting a bit late for you.
I'm getting late for you. Yeah.
So.
I'm happy to answer a few more questions. I'm fine. I'm a night owl. So
okay, all right. Well,
is just getting started.
So there is a related one. So Sue Dixon's asked a related one around China, but she's also added in. So China's taken a lot of action on renewable energy. Continues to buy polluting fossil fuels and so on. Have you any thoughts on how much China is on board with the whole climate change situation? And you've already discussed a little bit around that, but she's also gone on to say, and other major countries such as India, an underlying problem also of Australia is our government is bought out by the fossil fuel industry, and true of other global north countries, which you've also just discussed. So perhaps if you could just expand a little bit, just talked a bit about China. So what about India as well?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the last decade worth of climate negotiations, the Indian position has been, well, you guys have done it this way with cheap coal, and now you're telling us to slow down our job creation and economic development by investing in renewables. You know, it's that narrative that we need the jobs is so powerful and so dominant, and it can only be countered by a counter narrative that essentially demonstrates that we can have more jobs, more sustainable jobs, and better quality of life by accelerating the transition to renewable energy. And my way of pitching this is always by referring to the great work of Phil Lawn on the genuine progress indicator as a metric, as an alternative metric for measuring quality of life, as opposed to this obsession we have with GDP growth. So the thing that makes sense to a lot of people, including conservatives, is the following. Would you rather, you know, continue building pipelines and polluting the water source and soil and then paying for cancer treatment for everybody in town for the next 30 years, or invest in renewable energy production and have clean air, clean soil, and better quality of life and more sustainable jobs for the future? You know, so shifting the narrative by saying the cost of doing nothing, the cost of keeping up with the fossil fuel system, is actually unaffordable economically and ecologically in terms of our quality of life, and that this alternative is already within reach. I mean, it's cheaper,
Great.
and it's more sustainable, and it gives everybody better quality of life. So that's really the framework that we need to keep using. You're not going to convince India or China or any other country unless you can, you know, demonstrate that this transition is the right way to go. And it's not fair to pick on one or two countries and to ask them to do it with their own resources out of pocket, when the rest of the world is still using fossil fuels, and the rest of the world has used fossil fuels for. So that's why I think the fair way to do it is acknowledging the damage, which was global, and acknowledging who did the damage that forces India into this position today. And that's the UK, and that's the global north. So that's a framework for reparations. So now we can have a conversation with India that says, okay, we're all in this together. We were part of the problem. And now we want you, with the rest of us, to transition to renewable energy and to decarbonize. And we're going to transfer technology and financial resources to help you do it.
Yeah, no, very well put. And as you say, there's plenty of hypocrisy to go around, and there's plenty of poor framing that sort of contributes to the whole thing. Totally agree. The next question actually comes from YouTube, and it's actually related to some of the points we've already raised. And I might add a bit of a criticism that some have aimed at MMT, that somehow MMT doesn't solve corruption. So the question is from Jennifer. Professor, how would you address the tendency of corrupt leaders to intercept incoming funds and steal for their own enrichment?
Yeah, I mean, there's no MMT answer to this.
No.
Right? This has nothing to do with MMT. MMT is just shining a light on where those obstacles are. And, you know, the standard approach to dealing with corruption is having more transparency laws internationally and domestically, having resilient democratic institutions where you can identify these things, and protecting whistleblowers, and having checks and balances in the system. That has nothing to do with MMT, other than MMT acknowledges that democratic processes are extremely important, and that these anti-democratic, corrupt practices do actually shrink the fiscal policy space for governments, because they do impose those restrictions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the extent to that I would answer this question.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We've only got a couple more questions. Anne asked before, in terms of your 3-step process that you're outlined, is there a way, do we need steps 1 and 2, or can we just jump to step 3? Is there...
So, the reference here is to the reparations framework of truth and reconciliation.
I believe, yes.
I see. Well, number one, it's not my framework. It's the standard part of the reparations literature that you're not going to have a government, offer a public apology unless there is pressure and unless the truth comes out. And the way we've done this in the past is via truth and reconciliation commissions. Now, it can happen through other mechanisms, popular protests or social media campaigns or something like that. But I doubt it's going to happen spontaneously. A prime minister is going to come out on TV and say, we, offer a public apology to indigenous people. Those things take decades.
Seems unlikely.
Pressure. Yeah. Right. It's unlikely. So I'm not, strongly wedded to the idea of the 3 steps. I just think it's a reasonable process for building pressure, building a social movement. And it's not really just building pressure and social movements. It's an educational opportunity to get to those, well-informed pitchforks. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of anger against a particular, a president or prime minister or a group of people. And it's going to be, well, we want you to offer an apology. And then the apology comes, and then there's nothing left to implement the transformative policies that I laid out here. So I'm open to designing different strategies. I'm not particularly wedded to this. I just, I think what everything that I've presented here today, I can safely say nothing is really my own invention. I just took all of these pre-existing frameworks and ideas, try to put it together in a coherent way, hopefully, to provide a coherent framework for a global Green New Deal. I mean, the reparations framework is not new. Climate reparations is not my thing. Colonial reparations has been around for a long time. But all of these separate movements have been separate. And I think what I just try to do here is bring the MMT lens and say, well, let's put these pieces of the puzzle together in a coherent way and get all of these movements to push in the same direction.
So thank you, Fadhel, for that. There's just 2 more questions. The first one, I think you've actually already addressed quite a bit, but just in case there's anything else you want to add. So John says, greetings, Fadhel. Could you perhaps speak about how we begin to rethink affordability in terms of resources rather than finance, which, as I said, I think you've spoken a lot on. How can we begin to help shift entrenched thinking on this? And how can we think about affordability beyond the lens of a nation state, i.e. in terms of ecological limits, especially related to mineral extraction for renewable energy?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So absolutely, I think this question fits perfectly into this framework, and I think I acknowledged it maybe partially here. So the MMT framework borrows from Keynes's work on how do we pay for the war, which is Keynes's little booklet at the time, which highlighted essentially that it's not about finding the money, it's about finding the resources and mobilizing the productive resources in a way that allows us not to hit that inflation limit, right? And today, updating Keynes's work is not just about mobilizing the productive resources, it's about making sure that we don't hit the ecological limits or we don't cause more damage. And that's why I emphasize the importance of research and development, so we can do more with less, so we can do more with less damage. I mean, the whole thing about technological advancement was to produce things faster, better, cheaper, hopefully cleaner. And that was always, hopefully, at the end, cleaner. Now we need to bring that up front, that acknowledging that there is no such thing as an economy, that is independent of the of nature, of the ecological limits. At this point in human history, we have to put the ecological limits at the center of everything we do, because we've ignored that for a long time, and then build from there, as opposed to focus on jobs and economic growth and then hope for the best. We don't have that luxury anymore. So the ecological limits, one way to focus on that is via moving away from GDP as a main indicator to something like GPI, and then really prioritizing in research and development something oriented towards a circular economy, where every product we produce for purposes of consumption comes in a little box with the user manual and warranty papers and everything, and includes something like a living will that says this is how you dispose of me when you're done in 3 years or 5 years or whatever the life cycle of that. And not only just a piece of paper that says this is where you dispose of me, but building the entire ecosystem and infrastructure of taking every single piece in this piece of technology and repurposing it in a circular economy. Yeah, that's when we know we've reached a circular economy. And then you start there and you keep improving, because we've ignored this for far too long. And maybe we'll make it. This is the optimist in me. Yeah.
Fadhel, there's only a couple. There's another question that's come in that's related to the discussion you just had, but there's an extra piece which I think adds to what you've just said. And the extra piece is, given it comes from Alistair, if you're become convinced that obviously we're in a pretty dire situation from a climate sustainability perspective, and with warming and the risks of impact are getting worse and so on, how would you change your climate change? How would you change your climate change justice advocacy given this context? So what would be the advice if you were to give to, say, someone around as an advocate or a justice advocate in this space, given the context that we are now in? What might you suggest as to how they would add to their advocacy or change their advocacy given that?
So given what? Given the MMT information that we have here? Or
I think it's more MMT, but also if you became convinced that we're in a climate emergency, right? And if anything, it could even be a bit worse than what they've suggested. How would that change your climate change justice advocacy? So if the emergency is even more dire than it already is, right?
I think it should simply, set fire under your feet to act more urgently and to be bolder in your demands, and to build a stronger movement and really not allow what I think is a minority at this point. I'm not familiar with the Australian context, but after the forest fires you've had the last couple of years, after the 10 years of drought, after all of that, are people still thinking that climate change is not happening? I haven't seen public opinion polling, but I think reasonable people in Australia, conservatives or not, are probably aware of the climate emergency, are probably aware of the climate refugees that are moving all over the world. But I think if I use the case of the US as an analogous political system, maybe I'm off here, you tell me, you probably have a small minority of people who oppose, aggressive climate action, bold climate action. And those in the case of the US, they're elected officials, they're lobbyists, they're super PACs that fund them, and the media companies that spin their stories. And we can fit all of them in a football stadium. So I think what they're able to do with their powerful narrative is to force the rest of us, backed in a corner and say, if you support all of this, Green New Deal stuff, your job is going to be on the line. If you want to tax the fossil fuel companies, if you want to tax the fracking companies, your town will be, forced into mass unemployment. So now the average person who really wants clean air and clean water and everything, they say, well, if my job is on the line, if my livelihood is on the line, that I guess I'm not going to vote for Green New Deal candidates. I'm going to accept the status quo. And that's why it's important to empower those individuals with the counter narrative to call their bluff when they say your job is on the line. If you want us to tax the corporations, then your employer is on the line, your livelihood on the line. They know better and they can push back with an alternative narrative. So I truly believe that the majority of people in every country are for clean air, clean water, good paying jobs, and all the things that we've been advocating for. They're just, fear-mongered into believing that if they support any bold policies to fight climate change, that they will individually and their families will suffer the consequences via higher taxation or via losing their jobs and losing their livelihood.
Thank you for that. No, it's very well put. So there's just two more questions to go. One of them is more philosophical around MMT, so I might do that one last. But the next one is, the first one, sorry, you've already spoken a bit about this, and you've done presentations that I've seen of yours on YouTube that address this directly. So perhaps maybe just a dot point description around this. So the question is, could you elucidate on what is a realistic roadmap for a small island nation, or a poor country of any kind, whether it's South Pacific Island or Africa or whatever? What would their pathway be to obtain or to work towards that monetary sovereignty?
So number one, it varies from country to country, but the standard diagnosis really usually involves lack of food sovereignty, energy sovereignty as the main sources. So you're not going to go anywhere with your resilience as a country unless you build resilience in those areas, starting with sustainable agriculture, starting with renewable energy. You may not have the technological capabilities, so this is where joint partnerships with like-minded countries can be useful. So I often talk about South-South trade unions, where you have a collection of neighboring countries with complementary sets of resources and capabilities that can build a relatively large consumer base, at least larger than their own consumer base, and engage in something like the reference that I usually like to use is Airbus in Europe, which was created as a joint partnership between a number of European countries in order for it to be able to compete with Boeing in the US. There's no way that France by itself could have created, a company that could compete with Boeing or the Germans or the British by themselves. But a joint partnership did it. And all countries that contributed to that joint partnership benefited in terms of technological capabilities, in terms of job creation, in terms of value-added content. So it doesn't have to be, building airplanes. But let's pick one area, let's say, food resilience, let's say renewable energy, let's say medical equipment, or whatever the product is. And you can form a union of 10 countries with a joint partnership to contribute to producing, collectively and building resilience for that, for that particular region. As one country, you're not going to be able to compete with the Germans and the Americans and the Japanese. But if you put together 15 countries on a particular thing, you can create, at least you have a chance, right? But that requires political coordination, which brings another potential obstacle. So that's just an example. In terms of your foreign direct investment, for example, you can be more selective in your choice of which corporations you allow into your country. You can require joint partnerships. You can require that part of, for example, if you lack food sovereignty, if you lack energy sovereignty, you can be selective in bringing companies that help you build that resilience and require that a percentage of the output is to be available to the local market and so on. So this racing to the bottom thing has done so much damage to the global South. And it's part of this whole global neoliberal extractive system that we have. In terms of tourism, even for countries that rely heavily on tourism, you can develop a high value added kind of tourism that's not based on, extractive. Tourism itself is extractive because the more tourists you bring, the more water you consume, the more energy you have to import, and the more food you have to import. But if you focus on smaller volume of tourism as opposed to the mass tourism, but focus on high quality or high value added tourism that focused on reviving cultural heritage and bringing kind of tourists who are willing to pay a premium for a cultural experience that's based on sustainable food and sustainable transportation and sustainable housing, right? And these things create more domestic jobs for cultural heritage preservation and so on. As opposed to the standard tourism of everybody go to the beach and fill the swimming pools and nightclubs and waste a lot of energy and resources and do it on the cheap because there's another 150 countries trying to compete with you too.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. And even from the COVID situation recently with cruise ships to for instance, the South Pacific, it's interesting to see how that's affected things, right, both positive and negative, and highlights some of the points you've just raised.
Yeah, so in a pandemic mode, you can still continue to have, high value added type of cultural heritage tourism, because by definition, it's not the masses. By definition, you can do social distancing and safe practices, and you can continue your tourism industry. But, who's going to go to a crowded nightclub now? Yeah,
well, yes, very good point. So last question, and then we'll wrap this up. It's more about a philosophical viewpoint, I suppose, with MMT. And Darren says, looking at the global situation you've just explained, and we've been talking about the last hour and a half or so, the imposed neo-colonialism over various cultures, would you say progressive MMTers are ultimately communitarian, as in managing the commons according to cultural institutional rules?
Well, I'd like to say yes, but I can't speak for all MMTers. That is a philosophical question. Can you read it again, because I don't see it in front of me?
Sure. Let's see, bring it up again. Sorry, I'm just going to have to find it. It was moved.
Is it in the Q&A box?
Here we are. So it's, given everything we've just discussed, would you say, or do you have a view as to whether progressive MMTers are ultimately more aligned or interested in managing the commons according to cultural institutional rules? Or put another way, do you think that MMT kind of brings itself a lens that lends itself to that communal view?
I hope, so I confirm, I hope yes. I think we can't afford not to. Given everything we've discussed today about climate change and the ecological limits. I think in the MMT community, as many of you know, we're a very small crowd.
But growing, Fadhel.
Academics. It's a growing crowd. So we haven't really covered all the bases yet. This is an open invitation for all mainstream economists to join us. Bring a small army of economists to cover all of these issues. So especially our colleagues working in ecological economics, environmental economics. With an MMT lens, I think we can move the conversation much further on this front than where we are today. So my answer is yes, but it's a soft yes, because we haven't really established this as the goal. I would always refer back to the standard reference that MMT is a lens. You can take the MMT framework and apply it to benefit the 1%. That's actually how it's currently is. You can take the MMT framework and destroy the planet. That's how it's currently implemented. But most people in the MMT community are not in favor of this status quo. So the question is, are we moving in the direction that this question is suggesting? I think so. I think we can't afford not to, for the sake of the planet, for the sake of social justice and economic justice. At least I know I am, but I can't speak for everybody, obviously.
And look, I think there's two things we can add on to that. And Darren himself, who asked the question, posted this in chat, of the linking in with not just MMT, but the donut economics and the more
absolutely
holistic economic view.
Kate Raworth's work. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's what I meant when I referred to circular economy. Absolutely. Her work is fantastic. Yeah.
And I think it's worthwhile to point everyone that earlier this year we had the conference on sustainable prosperity, and
Adelaide,
in Adelaide, that's right, and in January, and the all of the talks are available on YouTube from that. And there was a number of discussions, and you mentioned Phil earlier around ecological economics and so on. And it seems to me, that conference in many ways brought that MMT and that more sustainable economics as a deliberate attempt to integrate them into a whole. And so I would point people to that conference and the resources around that that I think more fully expand upon that question and your response. Thank you again, Fadhel. On that, I think we have exhausted everyone's questions. And thank you very much for your time. And I'm going to hand you back over to Jane, and we'll wrap this thing up.
Okay, thank you, Fadhel, and it's been a real honor to have you here. And I think we all are big fans of how you communicate about MMT, and I think it makes a real difference how succinctly and powerfully you speak on what can be achieved. And we hope to follow your work and achieve the same, I think. And in saying that, also that this will be available on YouTube, and so people that have missed out, or if people who have attended, please share. It's important to get the word out, and we are, working. There is it is very urgent that we make change quickly, and so I hope we can spread the word. So, I think it's time to say farewell, and good night to Fadhel over in the US, and thank you to all our guests, attendees who came. Thank you, Marcus. Great Q&A, great questions, and we'll see you again soon, I hope.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.